What happens when a mother's ambition costs her daughter's life? How does a queen survive when the king prefers another woman, a woman 20 years his senior? Can a sister's loyalty be twisted into a weapon against her own brother? The Valois court was a world of silk and shadows, a place where a woman's greatest weapon was her mind and her sharpest dagger was a whispered word. Power was not given, it was taken, often from the person standing right next to you. Number 15, did a queen's love for her daughter become a weapon? A 14-year-old girl was sent to a foreign country to be queen. Her own mother read her private letters, searching for state secrets. A major European peace treaty was sealed not with handshakes, but with the marriage of a young girl to a man twice her age. This was the strange rivalry between Catherine de' Medici and her eldest daughter, Élisabeth of Valois. It was not a rivalry of open hostility. It was a conflict born of distance, duty, and a mother's relentless political ambition. Catherine genuinely loved Élisabeth. She was, by all accounts, her favorite child, but Catherine loved France more. When the devastating Italian wars ended in 1559 with the Treaty of Caddo-Cambresis, the terms were sealed with marriages. Élisabeth, originally betrothed to the Spanish heir, was instead married to his father, the widowed King Philip II of Spain. She was just a teenager. From the moment Élisabeth crossed the border into Spain, she was no longer just Catherine's daughter. She was a political asset. The Spanish court was cold, formal, and deeply suspicious of the French. Élisabeth was isolated. Her only real connection to home was her mother's letters, but Catherine's letters were not filled with simple maternal comfort. They were filled with instructions. She pressed her daughter constantly for information about the Spanish court. What were the king's moods? Who were his advisors? What were their plans for the Netherlands? Catherine expected her teenage daughter to act as a French agent inside the most powerful and secretive court in Europe. This placed Élisabeth in an impossible position. She was now Queen of Spain. Her loyalty was supposed to be to her husband and her new country. Yet her formidable mother demanded a loyalty that bordered on espionage. The tension was immense. The French ambassador to Spain often acted as a go-between, delivering Catherine's coded requests and reporting on Élisabeth's successes or failures in extracting information. The peak of this strange conflict came in 1565. Catherine arranged a meeting with Élisabeth at Bayonne on the French-Spanish border. It was disguised as a family reunion. On the surface, it was a lavish festival, but beneath the pageantry, Catherine was desperately trying to use her daughter's influence. She wanted Élisabeth to persuade Philip II to soften his harsh policies against Protestants. She believed her daughter's charm and Philip's affection for her could achieve a diplomatic breakthrough that her ambassadors could not. It did not work. Philip sent the hardline Duke of Alba in his place. The Duke refused to budge on any issue. The meeting was a political failure for Catherine. It also showed the limits of Élisabeth's influence. She was a beloved wife, but she was not a co-ruler. The rivalry wasn't between two women fighting for a man, but between a mother's political project and a daughter's new reality. Catherine's love was real, but it was conditional. It was tied to Élisabeth's usefulness to the French crown. And Élisabeth died in 1568. After a miscarriage, she was only 23. Catherine was heartbroken. She had lost her favorite daughter and, in the process, her most valuable, if reluctant, agent in the Spanish court. The weapon she had tried to wield was gone. Number 14. Could two women end a war their husbands started? One woman held the fate of the French king in her hands. The other was the most powerful woman in the Holy Roman Empire. Their negotiations saved thousands of lives and ended a war that had crippled two nations. They met without their male advisors. The rivalry between Louise of Savoy and Marguerite of Austria was not personal. It was political. It was a chess match played by two of the most skilled female politicians of the 16th century. Louise of Savoy was the mother of King Francis I of France. Marguerite of Austria was the aunt of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Their son and nephew were bitter enemies, locked in a seemingly endless war for control of Italy and Europe. In 1525, the French army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Pavia. Francis I was captured and taken to a prison in Madrid. France was leaderless. Louise of Savoy, who had been ruling as regent, was in a desperate situation. The country was on the brink of collapse. She needed to get her son back. Marguerite of Austria, regent of the Netherlands, saw an opportunity. Her nephew Charles V held all the cards. He could make extreme demands on the captive French king. The men had failed. Their warfare and diplomacy led to a stalemate of imprisonment and impossible demands. So, the women took over. Louise and Marguerite had known each other for years. They understood the complex web of European politics better than most men. They began to correspond directly, bypassing the stubborn male counselors on both sides. Their letters were a masterclass in diplomacy. They were formal, but with an undercurrent of shared experience. They were both women ruling in a man's world, trying to clean up a mess made by their male relatives. Their negotiations culminated in the Treaty of Cambrai in 1529. To finalize the details, they met in person in the city of Cambrai. For a month they negotiated. The resulting treaty was so completely their work that it became known as La Paix des Dames, or the Ladies' Peace. This was unprecedented. Two women had formally negotiated a major European peace treaty. The terms were a compromise. Francis I was released, but he had to renounce his claims to Italy. He had to marry Charles V's sister, Eleanor of Austria. And he had to hand over his two eldest sons as hostages until a massive ransom was paid. Louise had saved her son and her country from annihilation. Marguerite had secured a major victory for her nephew, solidifying his dominance. The rivalry was about whose family would control Europe. But their method was not war, it was negotiation. They showed that women could govern and achieve what men with armies could not. They were rivals, but their rivalry ended in peace, not destruction. Number 13, what happens when the queen is the quietest woman in the room? The king's male favorites wore more jewels than the queen. They spent more on clothes in a month than she did in a year. The queen, Louise de Lorraine, often dressed in simple white, a sign of her perpetual mourning for her family. The court of King Henry III was a strange place. It was decadent and deeply religious at the same time. The king surrounded himself with a group of handsome young men known as the Mignons. They were his favorites, his confidants, and his political allies. They were famous for their extravagant clothes, their wild parties, and their arrogance. The women of their families, like the Duchess of Joyeuse and the Duchess of Epernon, held significant sway at court. They were at the center of the social world. And then there was the Queen, Louise de Lorraine. Her rivalry was not with a single person. It was with the entire culture of the court that her husband had created. Louise was a gentle, pious, and unassuming woman. And Henry III had chosen her for love, a rarity for a king. He had seen her once and was captivated by her quiet beauty. But he did not change his lifestyle for her. While he loved her in his own way, his attention and the court's energy were focused on the Mignons. Louise's world was one of prayer and charity. The world of the court was one of ambition and excess. The wives and sisters of the favorites were key players in this world. They hosted lavish events and secured positions for their relatives. They were part of the glittering, competitive inner circle. Louise was not. She was respected, but she was not a center of power. She did not plot or scheme. She did not build a faction. This created a quiet, persistent tension. The court had a queen, but she did not act like one in the traditional Valois sense. She was not a political player like Catherine de Medici. She was not a glamorous trendsetter like Diane de Poitiers. Her quiet nature was, in itself, a form of opposition to the court's values. While the Mignons and their families flaunted their wealth, Louise's simple dress and piety were a constant, silent rebuke. The other women at court likely saw her as a non-entity, someone to be pitied or ignored, but her relationship with the king was more complex. Henry respected her piety. He often joined her on religious pilgrimages. In his own troubled way, he seemed to find a kind of peace in her presence that he could not find anywhere else. The rivalry was between two completely different ways of life. The loud, ambitious, and materialistic world of the court favorites, and the quiet, spiritual, and introverted world of the queen. In the end, Louise's world outlasted them. The Mignons met violent ends. Henry III was assassinated. Louise lived on for more than a decade, a lonely figure in white. The widowed white queen, a symbol of a different, more somber kind of power. Number 12, can you be a queen without a kingdom? She was Queen of France for just 17 months. She was Queen of Scotland, but ruled from France for most of her youth. Her claim to the English throne would ultimately cost her her life. Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived at the French court as a child of 5. She was betrothed to the Dauphin Francis, the future King Francis II. She grew up alongside the royal children of Henry II and Catherine de Medici. She was beautiful, intelligent, and charming. She was also a queen in her own right. This made her different. It made her a threat. Her primary rival during her time in France was her own mother-in-law, Catherine de Medici. When old King Henry II died in a jousting accident in 1559, Mary's young husband became King Francis II. Suddenly, the 17-year-old Mary was Queen of France. She and her powerful relatives, the Guise brothers, quickly took control of the government. They sidelined the Queen Mother, Catherine de Medici. Catherine had been waiting for years to wield power, and now she was being pushed aside by a teenager and her uncles. The rivalry was immediate and intense. It was a power struggle for control of the king and the country. And Mary had the advantage of being the king's beloved wife. Catherine had the advantage of experience and a deep understanding of French politics. The court split into factions. One supported the young queen and the Guises. The other looked to Catherine. Mary was not just Queen of France and Scotland. She also had a strong claim to the throne of England through her grandmother. The Guises encouraged her to use the title and coat of arms of the Queen of England. This was a direct challenge to Queen Elizabeth I. This act, driven by the ambition of her French family, created a lifelong enmity with the English queen. It was a rivalry that started at the Valois court, but would end on an executioner's block in England years later. For Catherine, Mary's ambition was a danger to France. Antagonizing England was risky. She preferred a more cautious foreign policy. She saw Mary's confidence as youthful arrogance. Mary saw Catherine's caution as weakness. The tension in the court was palpable. But their rivalry in France was short-lived. The frail King Francis II died in 1560 after a reign of less than a year and a half. With her husband's death, Mary's power in France evaporated overnight. She was no longer Queen of France. Catherine de Medici became regent for her next son, the young Charles I. Catherine was finally in charge. She made it clear that there was no longer a place for Mary at the French court. Within months, Mary was on a ship back to Scotland, a country she barely knew. The rivalry was over. Catherine had won. Mary's brief, brilliant reign as Queen of France was finished, and her long, tragic struggle for her Scottish and English crowns was just beginning. Number 11. Was the king's sister more powerful than his wife? The king's sister published a controversial book that is still studied today. The king's wife had 10 children, but held little political power. One woman was a star of the Renaissance. The other was a dutiful, often overlooked queen. The court of Francis I was dominated by 3 women: his mother, Louise of Savoy, his mistress, Anne de Pisseleu, and his sister, Marguerite de Navarre. His wife, Queen Claude of France, was often in the background. This created a subtle rivalry, not of open conflict, but of influence and importance. The rivalry was between Marguerite, the intellectual and political sister, and Claude, the quiet and fertile queen. Claude was the daughter of the previous king. Her marriage to Francis secured his claim to the throne. Her primary role was to produce heirs, and she did so successfully, giving birth to many children, including the future Henry II. She was pious, kind, and not interested in politics. She was often pregnant and in poor health. While respected for her position, she was not a major player in the games of the court. Her Marguerite de Navarre was the opposite. She was her brother's closest friend and intellectual companion, and Francis trusted her judgment and often used her as a diplomat. She was a writer, a poet, and a patron of the arts and new religious ideas. Her book, The Heptameron, was a collection of stories that explored love, religion, and the relationships between men and women. It was a groundbreaking work for its time. The rivalry was one of presence and impact. When important visitors came to court, they wanted to speak with Marguerite. When the king needed advice, he often turned to his sister. When reformers and artists sought protection, they went to Marguerite's circle. Claude, meanwhile, managed the royal nursery and attended religious services. This was not a hateful relationship. The two women seemed to respect each other's roles, but the structure of the court made their disparate levels of influence clear. Marguerite had the king's ear, Claude had the king's children. In the world of the Valois court, the ear was often more valuable than the nursery. Marguerite's power came from her intellect and her personal bond with the king. Claude's power was purely dynastic and biological. After Claude died at the young age of 24, Francis married Eleanor of Austria, the sister of his great rival, Charles V. But the dynamic remained. His sister Marguerite continued to be the most important woman in his life, alongside his mother and mistress. The queen was a formality, a part of a peace treaty. The sister was a partner. Marguerite's influence demonstrates that at the Valois court, family ties and personal ability could sometimes matter more than the official title of queen. Number 10, how does a Protestant queen challenge a Catholic regent? One queen was the leader of the Protestant cause in France. The other was the Catholic regent trying to hold the country together. Their personal faith became the battleground for the future of the kingdom. They were mothers whose sons were destined to be enemies. The rivalry between Catherine de Medici and Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, was one of the most significant of the era. It was not about courtly status or a king's affection. It was about God and power. It was a conflict that fueled the brutal French wars of religion. Jeanne was the ruler of the small kingdom of Navarre, a territory wedged between France and Spain. She was a formidable woman, intelligent, determined, and a fervent Calvinist Protestant, or Huguenot. She converted to Protestantism in 1560 and made it the official religion of her kingdom. She became the spiritual and political leader of the Huguenot faction within France. Catherine de Medici, as regent for her sons, was trying to navigate a kingdom tearing itself apart over religion. She was a devout Catholic, but her primary goal was the preservation of the Valois monarchy and the unity of France. For years, she tried to find a middle path, a way for Catholics and Protestants to coexist. She issued edicts of tolerance, trying to placate both sides. This put her in direct opposition to Jeanne. Jeanne did not want tolerance. She wanted religious freedom and security for her fellow Protestants. She saw Catherine's compromises as weakness and duplicity. Catherine, in turn, saw Jeanne's rigid faith as dangerous and seditious. She believed Jeanne's actions were threatening to destroy the kingdom. Their rivalry played out in negotiations, in letters, and through their children. Jeanne's son was the young Henry of Navarre. Catherine's children were the kings of France. The two women were maneuvering their sons into positions of power. They were the queens in a high-stakes chess game. The peak of the rivalry came in the lead-up to the marriage of their children. Catherine proposed a marriage between her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, and Jeanne's son, Henry of Navarre. On the surface, it was a gesture of peace, a way to unite the Catholic royal family with the leader of the Protestant faction. Catherine hoped it would end the civil wars. Jeanne was deeply suspicious. She traveled to the French court in 1572 to negotiate the terms of the marriage. The letters she wrote during this time reveal her distrust of Catherine and the decadent Catholic court. She felt it was a corrupt and godless place. She argued fiercely with Catherine over the details of the wedding ceremony. Jeanne, a staunch Protestant, did not want her son to participate in a Catholic mass. Just weeks before the wedding was to take place, Jeanne d'Albret died suddenly in Paris. The Huguenots immediately suspected she had been poisoned, perhaps by a pair of perfumed gloves sent by Catherine de Medici. Historians now believe she likely died of natural causes, but the rumor shows the depth of the hatred and suspicion between the two factions. The rivalry ended with Jeanne's death, but it set the stage for one of the most horrific events in French history. A few days after the wedding she had negotiated, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre began. Number 9, can a forgotten queen win a silent war? The king's first wife died young. His second wife was the sister of his greatest enemy. He ignored her for his mistress, who ran the court. The queen's household had its own budget, but the mistress's was twice as large. After the death of his first wife, Claude, King Francis I was forced to marry Eleanor of Austria as part of a peace treaty. Eleanor was the sister of the Holy Roman Emperor. Charles V, Francis's bitter rival. The marriage was purely political. It was loveless from the start. Francis already had a powerful and official mistress, Anne de Pisseleu, the Duchess of Étampes. This created a silent, sad rivalry between the new queen and the established mistress. Eleanor was a quiet, pious woman. She was known as Madame Lorraine, but she had none of the power that title should have brought. The real queen of the court was Anne de Pisseleu. Anne was beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious. She controlled access to the king, dispensed patronage, and influenced political appointments. She had a network of supporters and clients throughout the government. She was at the center of court life. Eleanor was isolated. Her Spanish entourage was sent home. She was surrounded by French ladies in waiting who were loyal to the king and his mistress. She was treated with the formal respect due a queen, but she was excluded from the real business of power. While Anne hosted glittering parties and political meetings, Eleanor spent her time in prayer and embroidery. The rivalry was one of public presence versus private isolation. Anne was visible, celebrated, and feared. Eleanor was nearly invisible. The king spent his days with Anne and his knights, often with other women. He performed his public duties with Eleanor at his side, but it was a cold formality. But Eleanor was not entirely powerless. As the sister of the emperor, she represented a political reality that Francis could not ignore. She was a constant reminder of the treaty he had signed and the delicate balance of power in Europe. She also had one person at court who was her ally, her stepson, the Dauphin, Henry, the future Henry II. Henry disliked his father's mistress, Anne. He found a quiet ally in his stepmother, Eleanor. They were both outsiders in Francis's court. When Francis I died in 1547, the tables turned instantly. The new king, Henry II, had his own powerful mistress, Diane de Poitiers. One of his first acts was to banish his father's mistress, Anne de Pisseleu. He took back the jewels and properties Francis had given her. Suddenly, Anne was powerless. Eleanor, the Dowager Queen, was treated with new respect by her stepson. He ensured she was given a comfortable and dignified retirement. She eventually left France and returned to her family in Spain. In the end, the quiet, forgotten queen outlasted her brilliant and powerful rival. Anne's power was tied completely to one man's affection. When he died, it vanished. Eleanor's status, based on her royal blood, endured. Number 8. What does a mother do when her son the king is a captive? The king was a prisoner in a foreign country. His mother, the regent, had to raise a massive ransom. The king's sister risked her life traveling through enemy territory to negotiate for his freedom. This was the world of Louise of Savoy. Louise of Savoy's primary role was as the mother of King Francis. She was the matriarch of the Valois dynasty, and her ambition for her son was limitless. Her main rivalries were with anyone who threatened her son's power or her own influence over him. One of her earliest and most significant challenges came from Anne of Brittany. Anne was the wife of 2 successive kings of France before Francis I. She was the Duchess of Brittany in her own right, a fiercely independent and powerful ruler. When she died, her daughter Claude inherited the duchy. Louise of Savoy engineered the marriage of her son Francis to Claude. This was a brilliant political move. It ensured that the strategically important Duchy of Brittany would finally be joined to the French crown. It also ensured her son would be king. The rivalry was a posthumous one in a sense, but very real. Louise spent her life trying to consolidate the power that Anne had so carefully guarded for Brittany. Louise was for a unified France, controlled by her son. Anne had always fought for an independent Brittany. Louise's marriage scheme was the final move that defeated Anne's lifelong political project. But Louise's greatest rival was not a person. It was circumstance. When Francis I was captured at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, Louise became regent of a defeated and demoralized France. Her rival was the Emperor Charles V, who held her son captive. She fought him not with armies, but with diplomacy and sheer will. She managed the kingdom, raised taxes for the ransom, and fought off internal rebellions. She started diplomatic overtures to the Ottoman Empire, a shocking move for a Christian ruler, trying to find an ally to put pressure on Charles V. Her most effective tool was another woman, her daughter, Marguerite de Navarre, whom she sent to Spain to negotiate directly for Francis's release. And her rivalry with Marguerite of Austria, the emperor's aunt, resulted in the Ladies' Peace. Louise of Savoy was a master of using female networks and diplomacy to achieve her goals. She operated in a world of men, but her greatest triumphs came from her dealings with other women, whether they were rivals or allies. Her entire life was a battle to secure her son's throne. She was the ultimate royal mother, and she rarely lost. Number 7. Could a brother and sister be best friends and bitter rivals? He was the king, known for his intelligence and his erratic behavior. She was his sister, famous for her beauty, wit, and scandalous life. They loved each other, but they could not trust each other. He once had her arrested and imprisoned. The relationship between Marguerite de Valois, known as Margot, and her brother King Henry III was one of the most complex and volatile in the Valois family. It was a rivalry fueled by sibling jealousy, political ambition, and a fundamental clash of personalities. They were the two most brilliant of Catherine de Medici's children, and they were often on opposite sides. From a young age, they were close, but as they grew older, their paths diverged. Henry became king. Margot was married off to the Protestant Henry of Navarre for political reasons. The marriage was supposed to bring peace to France. Instead, it was the prelude to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Margot found herself trapped in a marriage she did not want and caught between her Catholic family and her new Protestant husband. And Henry III was a king who demanded absolute loyalty. He was surrounded by his favorites, the Mignons, and was deeply suspicious of anyone with an independent power base, including his own sister. Margot was clever and politically astute. She had her own network of friends and allies. She often sympathized with a moderate political faction that sought compromise, which Henry III viewed as treason. Their rivalry flared up over her relationship with her younger brother Francis, Duke of Alençon. Alençon was ambitious and constantly plotting against Henry III. Margot was close to Alençon and supported his ambitions, seeing him as an ally against the king's favorites. This infuriated Henry III. He saw his sister as a co-conspirator. In 1578, he publicly humiliated her at court, accusing her of scandalous behavior, and effectively banished her. She retreated to her husband's court in Navarre, but even there, the rivalry continued. She and her husband Henry of Navarre were often at odds, and Margot began to act as an independent political player. She seized the town of Agen and tried to carve out a territory for herself. This was an open act of rebellion against her brother, the king. And Henry III's response was swift. He sent forces to capture her. She was imprisoned in the fortress of Usan. The king, who had once been her childhood playmate, was now her jailer. Their rivalry was a tragic story of a family torn apart by the pressures of power. Both were intelligent and capable, but their mutual suspicion and the toxic political environment of the late Valois court turned them into enemies. Margot remained a prisoner until after Henry III's assassination. In a strange twist of fate, her own husband, Henry of Navarre, became the next king of France, and she, the long-imprisoned sister, became the queen of France he had to divorce to secure his dynasty. Number 6. Do you obey your mother or your husband? She was the Queen of France, married to a weak and sickly king. Her mother-in-law was the formidable Catherine de Medici, the true ruler of the country. Her uncles, the Guise brothers, were the most powerful nobles in the kingdom. She was caught in the middle. This was the rivalry between Catherine de Medici and her daughter-in-law, Mary, Queen of Scots. When Mary's husband, Francis II, ascended the throne, it was Mary and her Guise uncles who took power, not the king's mother. Catherine, who had waited decades for this moment, found herself politically sidelined. This created an immediate and intense struggle for influence over the young king. And Mary had the advantage of youth, beauty, and the king's deep affection. Francis II adored his wife and was easily influenced by her and her charismatic uncles. The Duke of Guise and the Cardinal of Lorraine effectively ran the government. They controlled policy, patronage, and the king's schedule. Catherine had the advantage of experience and patience. She knew the French court and its players better than anyone. She began to quietly build her own alliances, waiting for her opportunity. She represented a more moderate political path, while the Guises were champions of an aggressive Catholic policy. The court became a battleground between these two factions. The rivalry played out daily. Who got to see the king? Whose advice did he take on matters of state? Who controlled the royal finances? Mary, as queen, held the preeminent social position. Her apartments were the center of court life, but Catherine, as the queen mother, held a deep residual authority. Many nobles were wary of the Guises' ambition and looked to Catherine as a counterbalance. The foreign policy of France was also a point of contention. The Guises pushed Mary to assert her claim to the English throne, openly challenging Elizabeth I. This was a dangerous game that Catherine felt was not in France's best interest. She preferred a more diplomatic approach to avoid a costly war with England. The rivalry, however, was destined to be short. And King Francis II had always been frail. In the winter of 1560, he died from an ear infection. He was only 16 years old. His death changed everything. In an instant, Mary was no longer the Queen of France. She was a 18-year-old dowager queen with no official power. Catherine de' Medici moved swiftly. Her second son, Charles the Next, was the new king, and he was only 10 years old. Catherine had herself declared regent. She was finally in control of France. She had won. She quickly consolidated her power, marginalized the Guises, and made it clear that Mary was no longer the center of the court. Mary's presence in France was a political inconvenience. Within a year, Mary was sailing back to Scotland. Her brief and brilliant rivalry with Catherine de' Medici was over. Number 5. Can two mistresses share a king? One mistress was the king's first great love. The other became his official mistress and the most powerful woman in France. For a time, their time with the king overlapped. One had the king's heart in his youth. The other had his mind in his prime. The court of Francis I was the scene of a rivalry between two of his mistresses, Françoise de Foix, Countess of Chateaubriand, and Anne de Pisseleu de Hailly, Duchess of Etampes. It was a classic tale of a rising favorite displacing an old one. Françoise de Foix was the king's mistress during the early part of his reign. She was beautiful, cultured, and held the king's affection for about a decade. She was a key figure at court, and her brothers were given important positions in the army and the church. Her power was entirely dependent on the king's love for her. Around 1526, after Francis returned from his captivity in Spain, a new young woman at court caught his eye. She was Anne de Pisseleu, one of his mother's maids of honor. She was blonde, witty, and highly intelligent. The king was completely captivated. He began to pursue her, and soon she replaced Francois in his affections. The rivalry was not a quick change. For a time, both women were at court. It was a deeply humiliating position for Francois. She had to watch as the king showered her rival with gifts and attention. The court, always quick to follow the king's lead, shifted its allegiance to the new favorite. Courtiers who had once flocked to Francoise now sought the favor of Anne. Anne was more politically ambitious than Francoise had been. She was not content to be just a lover. She became the king's closest advisor and confidante. Francis trusted her judgment and discussed matters of state with her. He made her the Duchess of Etampes, giving her land, titles, and a huge income. She built a powerful political faction, placing her relatives and allies in key positions. The rivalry between the two women became a proxy for larger political battles at court. Anne led a faction that favored political alliances with Protestant princes in the Ottoman Empire against the Emperor Charles V. Her rival faction was led by the Constable of France, Anne de Montmorency, who favored a Catholic alliance. Interestingly, Montmorency's faction was supported by the king's other great female rival, his next mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who was the favorite of his son, the Dauphin Henry. So, Anne de Pisseleu was fighting a war on two fronts against the memory and remaining friends of the old mistress, Françoise de Foix, and against the rising power of the future mistress, Diane de Poitiers. She won the first battle. Françoise eventually retired from court. The second battle she would lose spectacularly. When Francis I died, Anne's power vanished instantly. The new king, Henry II, and his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, took revenge, stripping Anne of her titles and wealth. The rivalry showed how precarious the power of a royal mistress was. It lasted only as long as the king's life. Number 4, must a daughter betray her mother to survive? Her mother arranged her marriage to a heretic to end a civil war. Her mother may have known about the massacre that was planned for the wedding. She was used as a political pawn her entire life, by her mother, her brothers, and her husband. The relationship between Catherine de Medici and her youngest daughter, Marguerite de Valois, was a lifelong rivalry of manipulation and mistrust. It was perhaps the most painful of all the rivalries because it was between a mother and daughter who were, in many ways, very much alike. Both were intelligent, politically shrewd, and determined to survive. From the beginning, Margot was a pawn in her mother's political games, and Catherine used her daughter's proposed marriages as bargaining chips with foreign powers. Margot's beauty and royal status were assets to be deployed for the good of France. This culminated in the infamous marriage to the Protestant leader Henry of Navarre. Catherine saw the marriage as her masterstroke, a way to finally bring peace to the religiously divided kingdom. Margot was a devout Catholic. She did not want to marry a Protestant, but she had no choice. She was ordered to marry Henry by her mother and her brother, King Charles IX. The wedding, in August 1572, was supposed to be a symbol of reconciliation. Instead, it became the trigger for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Protestants who had come to Paris for the wedding were slaughtered. Historians debate Catherine's exact role in planning the massacre, but it is clear that the political climate she created made it possible. Margot was horrified. She famously saved the lives of several Protestants, including her husband, by hiding them in her chambers. This event created a permanent rift between Margot and her mother. How could she ever trust the woman who had forced her into a marriage that became a bloodbath? The rivalry continued for years. Catherine saw her daughter as unreliable and disloyal. Margot chafed under her mother's control. She often sided with her rebellious younger brother, Francis, against her other brother, King Henry III, and by extension against Catherine's policies. Catherine's letters to Margot are a mix of maternal affection and cold political calculation. She scolds her for her behavior, advises her on how to manage her husband, and always reminds her that her first duty is to the French crown. Margot, in her own memoirs, paints a picture of a mother who was distant, manipulative, and often cruel. The rivalry was not just political, it was deeply personal. Catherine disapproved of Margot's scandalous love life. Margot resented her mother's constant interference. They were two powerful, intelligent women who could never see eye to eye. Catherine used her daughter for the state. Margot fought for a measure of personal and political freedom that her mother was never willing to grant. It was a relationship defined by a fundamental conflict: Catherine's demand for obedience versus Margot's desire for autonomy. Number 3, how does an old mistress defeat a new one? One woman controlled the king. The other woman controlled the king's son, the heir to the throne. The court was divided into two camps. Everyone knew that when the old king died, a political earthquake would follow. This was the great rivalry between Anne de Pisseleu, Duchess of Étampes, the mistress of King Francis I, and Diane de Poitiers, the mistress of the Dauphin, Henry. You know, it was a unique situation. The court had two powerful mistresses at the same time, one for the present and one for the future. Their rivalry dominated the last decade of Francis I's reign. Anne de Pisseleu was at the height of her power. She was the king's most trusted advisor. She was intelligent, politically savvy, and had built a formidable network of supporters. She was known as the most beautiful of the learned and the most learned of the beautiful. Her faction at court generally favored a more flexible foreign policy and was tolerant of the new Protestant ideas. And Diane de Poitiers was about 20 years older than the Dauphin Henry, but she had captivated him completely. She had known him since he was a boy, offering him comfort when he returned from being a hostage in Spain. Their bond was deep and unbreakable. Diane was a staunch Catholic and politically conservative. She allied herself with the powerful Constable Anne de Montmorency. Her faction was the opposite of Anne de Pisseleu's. The court became a battleground for these two women. They competed for status, for influence, and for the future. Every political appointment, every foreign policy decision was seen through the lens of their rivalry. If Anne's faction won a debate in the King's Council, it was a loss for Diane's faction, and vice versa. They fought over art, architecture, and fashion. Both were great patrons, and their competing tastes shaped the French Renaissance. The rivalry was personal and vicious. Anne famously referred to Diane as the king's old fossil because of her age. And Diane, in turn, worked quietly behind the scenes, building her power base and waiting. She knew her position was secure as long as she held Henry's heart. And Anne's power, on the other hand, was entirely dependent on the aging and increasingly ill King Francis. The courtiers had to make a difficult choice. Do you side with the current power, Anne, and risk the wrath of the future king? Or do you side with the future power, Diane, and risk being frozen out by the current king? It was a high-wire act. The end of the rivalry came on March 31st, 1547, the day Francis I died. The shift in power was immediate and absolute. As soon as the old king was dead, the new king, Henry II, took charge. His first act was to settle the score. He gave his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, the beautiful Chateau de Chenonceau, which Francis had given to Anne. He stripped Anne of her jewels and banished her from court. Her entire political network collapsed overnight. Diane de Poitiers had won. Her patience had paid off. She would go on to be the virtual Queen of France for the next decade, proving that in the long game of court politics, the future always defeats the present. Number 2. Can a wife defeat the other woman? The king gave his mistress the crown jewels. He signed official documents with a combined initial of his name and hers. He gave her a chateau that was meant for the queen. For over 20 years, the queen had to watch as another woman lived the life that should have been hers. This was the ultimate rivalry of the Valois court, the long, bitter struggle between Queen Catherine de Medici and Diane de Poitiers, the mistress of her husband, King Henry II. It was a rivalry that defined Catherine's life for 2 decades and shaped her into the formidable ruler she would later become. Catherine was married to Henry when they were both 14. It was a political match. Henry was not in love with his wife. His heart belonged to Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years his senior. Diane had been his mentor and confidante since he was a boy. Their bond was absolute. When Henry became king in 1547, he did not hide his relationship with Diane. He made her the most powerful woman in France. For Catherine, this was a daily humiliation. Diane was the true queen of the court. She advised the king on policy, controlled access to him, and dispensed patronage. Her friends and relatives were given the most important jobs. She was beautiful, athletic, and confident. Catherine, in the early years, was seen as a foreigner, plain, and she struggled for a decade to produce an heir. Her position was insecure. Many at court suggested the king should divorce her. The rivalry was played out in the very architecture of their lives. Henry gave Diane the magnificent Chateau de Chenonceau, a jewel of the Loire Valley. The crown jewels, which should have been worn by the queen, were often worn by the mistress. The king's official monogram was an intertwined H and D. While it could be read as Henry and Diane, it could also be seen as an H and 2 C's for Catherine, back to back. This ambiguity was a perfect symbol of Catherine's position, officially central, but privately eclipsed. Catherine had no choice but to endure it. She could not challenge Diane openly. To do so would be to challenge the king himself. So she learned to be patient. She played the part of the dutiful wife. She focused on producing children, eventually having 10, which secured her position. She watched, she learned, she saw how Diane wielded power, how she built alliances, how she managed the king. It was a long and difficult apprenticeship in the art of ruling. She had to maintain a civil public relationship with her rival. They attended the same parties, the same hunts, the same council meetings. But the tension was always there. The court was divided into the queen's household and the mistress's circle. The rivalry ended in a single moment on July 10th, 1559. King Henry II was mortally wounded in a jousting tournament. A splinter from a lance had pierced his eye. As he lay dying for 10 days, Catherine took control. She barred Diane de Poitiers from the king's sick room. The woman who had been his companion for over 2 decades was not allowed to say goodbye. As soon as Henry was dead, Catherine's revenge was swift and complete. She was now the regent for her young son, the new king. She immediately ordered Diane to return the crown jewels. She forced her to give up the Chateau de Chenonceau, offering her a less desirable castle in exchange. She banished Diane from court. After more than 20 years of humiliation, Catherine had won. The queen had finally defeated the mistress. The long years of waiting were over, and Catherine de' Medici's own time as the most powerful woman in France had just begun. Number one, who was the most powerful woman at court? Is it the queen, who carries the heir? Is it the king's mother, who knows all the secrets? Is it the king's sister, who is his best friend? Or is it the king's mistress, who shares his bed and his thoughts? At the court of Francis I, all these women vied for power, but the two main contestants in the later years were his mother, Louise of Savoy, and his official mistress, Anne de Pisseleu. This was a classic rivalry between the matriarch and the new favorite. Louise of Savoy had dedicated her entire life to her son. She had schemed and fought to put him on the throne. She had ruled France as regent while he was at war or in captivity. She was a shrewd, experienced politician who saw herself as the co-ruler of France. She was the old guard, the power behind the throne for decades. Anne de Pisseleu was the new power. She was young, beautiful, and had the king's complete adoration. Dear Francis was not just infatuated with her, he respected her intellect. He discussed everything with her, from art to politics. She quickly learned to use this influence. She was ambitious and wanted to be more than just a royal mistress. She wanted to be a political player. This put her on a direct collision course with Louise of Savoy. Louise was not used to sharing her son's confidence with another woman. She saw Anne as an upstart, a threat to her own position as the king's primary advisor. The court became a field of quiet battle between the two women. They fought over influence. When a political appointment was being made, both Louise and Anne would push their own candidates. They fought over the king's time and attention. They fought through their factions. The older, more established nobles tended to align with the queen mother, Louise. The younger, more ambitious courtiers saw their future with the rising star, Anne. It was a delicate balance. The king loved and respected his mother deeply. He owed her everything, but he was also deeply in love with his mistress. He was caught between them. For a time, Louise's experience and established authority gave her the upper hand. But as she aged, and as Anne's relationship with the king deepened, the balance of power began to shift. Anne was clever. She did not challenge Louise openly. Instead, she worked to make herself indispensable to the king. She shared his interests in Renaissance art and literature. She engaged him in witty conversation. She offered him a kind of companionship that his aging mother could not. The rivalry was ultimately decided by nature. Louise of Savoy died in 1531. With her death, Anne de Pisseleu's primary rival for the king's ear was gone. For the next 16 years, until the end of Francis I's reign, Anne was the undisputed most powerful woman in France. She had a network of clients, she influenced policy, and she amassed a great fortune. She had outmaneuvered the old queen mother and won the long, quiet war for influence. Her victory, however, was temporary. Her real rival was not the king's mother, but the next king's mistress, Diane de Poitiers. And that was a battle she was destined to lose.